Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It is now at 11 o'clock. We're going to go ahead and start the meeting. Thank you for joining us on this webinar today, Developing Effective Employment Policies for the New Way That We Work. This is sponsored by the Salt Lake Chamber Small Business Committee, and I am Natalie Caddis, one of the chairs of the Small Business Committee and the CEO of Caddis Enterprises. For those of you who don't already know, the Chamber's Small Business Committee promotes and represents the interests of businesses that are fewer than 100 employees, as well as helps amplify the voices of small businesses. Employment law is radically different today than it was even a year ago, and many businesses need to update their policies to better reflect the new work environment that we are in. Salt Lake City's based SixFifty has worked with the law firm Wilson Sonsini to update over 50 employment policies that account for the COVID pandemic, vaccines and workforce, that more remote and more diverse workforces. During the webinar, SixFifty will discuss the kinds of policies Utah businesses need, the importance of keeping policies up to date, and their automated employee handbook solution. So we've partnered with them, and I'm proud to introduce to you Kimball Parker, the CEO of SixFifty, and Adrienne Jack, Director of Legal Products for SixFifty. This will be an informative session. We'll have the opportunity to post questions in the Q&A function, and then we'll open it up towards the end. So without further ado, I am pleased to welcome Kimball and Adrienne. Welcome.
Hey, thank you so much. Thank you so much for having us. Again, I'm Kimball Parker. I'm the CEO of SixFifty. I want to start by kind of talking about who we are a little bit to kind of build off what Natalie had described. We are the technology arm of the law firm Wilson Sonsini, and in the technology space, Wilson Sonsini is like the New York Yankees of law firms. They helped found Apple and brought them public. Same with Google, Twitter, Lyft, Tesla, SpaceX. Here in Utah, they helped found Pluralsight and brought them public. Same with Domo, Cricket, who just went public. So SixFifty is based here in Salt Lake City. The firm, though, is based in Silicon Valley. And so we work with Wilson Sonsini to create automated legal products like TurboTax, but with the best lawyers in the world behind it. And the idea is to bring down the price so that you don't have to be Apple to afford their legal help. And so we have a really fun job. We build products for businesses who have a legal need, and we also build automated legal products for people who need legal help. We built a little product called HelloLandlord.org that's helped over 14,000 people at risk of losing their homes during the pandemic, all for free. But today we're going to talk about employee handbooks, as Natalie mentioned, and we have some interesting experience in this area. And I'm just going to give you a little background. Wilson Sonsini has some of the best employment experts in the nation, and a lot of our clients, SixFifty's clients, and a lot of the firm's clients have been struggling to figure out what to do during and after COVID. And so we worked with Wilson Sonsini to build an automated handbook that basically takes into account the world today with COVID and vaccines and a workforce that's more remote and mobile. And like Natalie mentioned, there are over 50 employment policies that we've automated, from telecommuting to social media to jury leave. And the policies cover the law in all 50 states. It was a huge endeavor. So anyway, I'm telling you this because we're going to hear from the main person who helped build that tool. Her name is Adrienne Jack. She's the director of legal product at SixFifty, and she's probably the best lawyer that I know. She graduated near the top of her class from one of the best law schools in the nation. She then worked 5 years for one of the best law firms in Washington, D.C., Hogan Lovells. She did this all while raising 4 children, and she's actually due with her 5th in a month. So this is a spectacular person in a lot of respects. We were lucky enough to poach her away to help us build these automated legal products with us. And she's really the one who translated Wilson Sonsini's employment legal knowledge into our employee handbook product. And it's given her a really unique view into employment law today. And I don't think it's a stretch to say that Adrienne understands how companies should arrange their policies for this new reality better than almost anyone in the nation. And again, we're lucky to have her here in Utah. So Adrienne's going to go first. She's going to speak. We'll pause for some Q&A. After that, I'm going to jump back in and I'll show you, for those who want to see it, I'll show you our employee handbook product. So for those of you who are not interested in seeing the tool, that's completely fine. That's a great time to jump off, and we won't be offended, I promise. So with that, I'm going to turn the time over to the one, the only, Adrienne Jack.
Thank you, Kimball. That's a very kind introduction. Like Kimball said, we are seeing a very unique employment landscape. And because of that, that kind of prompted us to create our SixFifty employee policy tool that creates employment policies and employee handbook for companies in this new employment law reality that we're seeing, which is different and unique than what we've ever seen before. So thank you, Kimball. We'll walk through kind of what the employment landscape looks like, why employment policies are important, how companies are struggling or working to keep their policies updated and managed, and then answer some Q&A. And then Kimball, like he said, will jump into our employment policy tool that you can see how we've solved this problem. So employment law is an area of law that usually changed very slowly. So previously we saw maybe 1 or 2 changes in a year period, but it was very slow to change. But now we've seen dramatic changes in employment law just within the last year. We've seen a majority of the workforce shift to remote working. Some is for the short term and some is indefinitely. We've seen companies implement health screenings, cleaning protocols, vaccine policies, and other COVID-19 precautions that are really unprecedented. We've never seen anything like this before. We've also seen federal and state laws that implement new sick and leave policies to help employees cope with the COVID-19 pandemic. And we've also seen, due to recent social events, we've seen an increased focus on social justice issues and diversity, equity, and inclusion. And that's something now that's more important to employees than ever. They're looking to their company to make statements and to set policies that promote these issues. So employee handbooks have historically been created when a company reaches a critical mass of employees. Sometimes that can be around 15 to 25 employees, and the company decides it's no longer sufficient to deal with employees on an ad hoc basis. They really need some structure and consistency when dealing with employees and any of the employment issues they might have. So companies have historically implemented employee handbooks or employment policies once, and then kind of put them on the shelf until an issue arises. And then maybe there's a harassment complaint at the company, or an employee has a frequent tardiness issue, or an employee asks about parental leave, or posts something on social media that implicates the company that the company isn't comfortable with. And then the company has a moment of panic and they're looking to their employment policies to say, what is our policy on this issue? Do we have something that addresses this? But this is a very reactive rather than a proactive approach. And this is really no longer sufficient to cope with the dynamic workforce that we're seeing right now. Companies really suffer if they wait until an issue arises to then address these issues through policies. And then those companies are scrambling to seek legal counsel, and they're looking at their handbooks and employment policies that have outdated laws, or it just really doesn't reflect the way the company works. It doesn't reflect how the company's even operating, or maybe the company has expanded to include a bigger workforce or in new states that the employment policies or handbook doesn't account for. So companies can really benefit from being more proactive and implementing policies that account for the dynamic workforce and that they're easy to understand and access for employees. Employment policies really set the foundation of the relationship for employees. They affect the company's ability to manage their workforce and their operations, and can really take some of the stress off the company when it comes to employment issues that might arise. Employment policies also set the expectations for both employees and for the company. So they set the expectation for what the company expects from employees. It can be helpful when onboarding new employees who might not understand the way the company works, and give them an overview of what the company expects from them. but also they're very beneficial for seasoned employees who are adjusting to a new work environment that we've never seen before, brought on by the pandemic. So the pandemic has brought a lot of unclear expectations for employees of maybe the company historically had policies, but those policies really don't translate into the new work environment we're seeing. Employees might have questions of, how does the dress code apply when I'm working from home all the time? Or what does a company expect from me if I'm on video calls all day? Are there expectations that the company has with respect to that? And then also these policies can set the expectation for what employees can expect from the company. It can outline benefit policies and leave policies and even set the terms and conditions of employment, so employees know what they can expect from the company. Employee handbooks are a valuable resource for employees to have on hand. Like I said, employees are navigating a new world of remote working, and they have more questions than ever, but they also have fewer opportunities to ask all of those questions that might arise, especially during this pandemic. They may no longer be able to access human resources as readily, or even other coworkers or mentors to ask the questions they might have based on the new working reality. So an employee handbook that really anticipates all of the new work environment can be very valuable for employees to use as a resource. Employment policies can also meet the company's legal obligations. Many states have default laws that apply if the company doesn't have a written, clear policy that states otherwise. And some states even say that that written policy has to be acknowledged and signed by employees. And since a lot of companies have employees acknowledge that they've received and understand the employee handbook, this can be a great way to become legally compliant by employees acknowledging that they understand those policies, and that meets the company's legal obligation. One example of that is how companies treat unused paid time off or vacation. A lot of states have a default law that says, unless you have a written policy to the contrary, you have to pay out employees' unused PTO or vacation time. But if you have a written policy that says, we don't pay this out, then the company can avoid doing so. But they have to have that written obligation and that written policy. And courts have held that having an employee handbook or employment policy would satisfy that legal obligation that the employer has. So they can be a great communication tool with employees, but they can also meet legal obligations, which is also very important. And companies need to comply with the state laws where their employees are located. And so if they have employees in various jurisdictions, an employee handbook is a great way to show that the company is complying with all of the state laws where their employees are located. Employment policies can also be a safeguard for the company if there are employees who are not meeting the company's expectations. Employment policies that are well written can set forth the standard that the company expects from employees, but then also indicate that the possible consequences if employees don't meet that expectation. And this can be a great way for the company to set a clear standard for what they expect, but then also what employees can expect if they're not meeting that company expectation. And finally, employee handbooks can be a great asset in litigation. No company ever wants to be in litigation, but employment law litigation can be expensive and exhausting on a company's resources. And so having a clear, well-written employee handbook can be a great resource to have to help the company if they're in that situation. Similarly, if there's an outdated or old employee handbook, employees can be confused about what the company expects. If the employee handbook doesn't reflect how the company's operating, it can also have outdated laws or not have new laws that have been implemented in the interim. And then also it cannot reflect the state laws where the company operates. Maybe the company implemented a handbook when they had 20 employees in one state, but now they've expanded to 4 states and have 100 employees. And that employee handbook really only speaks to one state, but the company really needs an updated handbook that reflects all the states where the company's operating, and the company has employment law obligations in all of those states. And finally, an old, outdated handbook can be a real liability in litigation that the company has to work with. So employee handbooks and employment policies are extremely important and can be very valuable, but they're also very difficult to manage and keep up to date. Keeping these employee handbooks, employment policies updated is very resource intensive. It costs a lot of time and money if a company is turning to outside counsel every time they want to make a change to their employee handbook. Many businesses during the pandemic are already struggling to stay afloat as it is, and they're not inclined to spend their additional resources to keep their employee handbook updated when it might take a lot of revisions and a lot of time and money commitment. And even for companies that do want to keep their handbooks updated, it's constantly changing. We're seeing employment law changes due to the pandemic on weekly or monthly bases. That's difficult for the company to stay compliant with, even if they want to, because of the frequency of the changes. So this issue, and plus the importance of the employment policies, kind of led us to create a tool to help companies efficiently solve this problem. But like I said, these policies have changed so rapidly in just the past year. I want to speak to just 5 policies that we've seen change drastically that companies should think about updating or keeping compliant with new laws, and how these policies may have changed. So first, remote working policies. Typically, remote working policies address remote work as kind of an occasional, as-needed basis, and they might have old eligibility requirements that employees would need to abide by. Whereas now, remote working might be the norm, that all employees are expected to work remotely. And so that policy has changed a lot. And also, a lot of old remote working policies might not reflect the company's protocols on video conferencing and dress code when employees are working from home for long periods of time or indefinitely, and what the company expects in those situations. We've seen a lot of companies implement video conferencing policies, which is something we've never seen before, but that can become part of a remote working policy because it is very important and coincides with employees who are working remotely for the long term. Similarly, temporary relocation policies, these historically would say that employees need to stay within a certain area of the original workplace. But during the pandemic, we've seen employees who think, oh, I'm working remotely, I might as well move to Hawaii and work there. That would be a great idea. But that employees changing their location and their residence has significant tax and employment law implications for companies. And if employees aren't aware of those, it can put the company in a really unfortunate situation if they're scrambling to comply with laws that they weren't anticipating complying with. So having a temporary relocation policy that really addresses when can employees temporarily relocate? How do you define temporary? Is it a month? Is it 6 months? What does that look like? Do employees need to ask the company for permission, or do they just need to inform the company? And how much notice does the company need to have before employees relocate? There are a lot of questions that have become more important as temporary relocation becomes a lot more common for employees. Sick leave policies have also changed a lot. We've seen new federal sick leave, we've seen states implement sick leave laws, and even county and local jurisdictions implement mandatory sick leave that companies have to provide to their employees. And these new laws wouldn't be reflected in the company's employee handbook. We've also seen companies that expand what it means to when employees can take sick leave. So for example, companies might decide that employees can use sick leave to care for a child whose school or place of business has been closed due to COVID-19, and that might be an eligible use of sick leave. Additionally, companies might decide to allow employees to use sick leave if they're caring for a relative or family member who has to quarantine or isolate due to COVID-19. So old sick leave policies likely need to be updated to reflect new laws or new company policies about when and how sick leave can be used. Technology systems is also a policy that has changed a lot. With a shift to remote working, the line between company property and personal property has become blurred for a lot of employees. An updated technology policy should reinforce that employees should not have an expectation of privacy if they're still using a company device. And this might employees might have forgotten that they're still using their work device even though they're in their home, and it really feels like it's a personal device because they've been in their home and they're so far from the workplace. But if it's a company device, they should still realize that the company can monitor and access all of the information on their company device. Similarly, technology systems policies have changed a lot because companies are providing employees with additional technology resources if they're working remotely for the long term. So those policies should explain what additional technology the company offers, any reimbursements that the company provides for technology to help employees work remotely, for the long term. And then finally, an EEOC and anti-discrimination policies. This is one that has not changed for a long time. Usually EEOC and anti-discrimination policies have looked the same for a decade, but we've seen changes to this because of the increased focus on social justice issues and also due to the pandemic. So we've seen, due to a recent Supreme Court case, we've seen the protected characteristics that are outlined in an EEOC policy. We've seen that expanded to include gender identity and sexual orientation as a protected characteristic that should be included in an EEOC policy. And similarly, the EEOC has really taken a center role in talking about when companies can ask employees about COVID-19 symptoms. Typically, companies are reluctant to ask employees about any medical conditions, but the EEOC has spoken and said that companies can ask about COVID-19 symptoms, and companies can also implement mandatory vaccine policies if the company decides to take that approach. So we're seeing a lot of movement in the EEOC area that historically has not taken place. With the burden of, and these are just 5 policies, I think we could talk about many more policies that have changed. Either the law has changed or how the policy works have changed, or just additional considerations that should be included in these policies, but wanted to give you a flavor for things companies should think about and how to update policies due to this new employment law world that we're living in. And so with the burden of keeping all these employment policies updated, we've created an efficient solution for companies to manage this and to stay on top of the most current employment law. So we'll pause here and answer some of the questions in the Q&A. Are there any questions that should be answered live? I haven't looked at those.
Yeah, Adrienne, let me tee some of those up for you. So here's a question. What employment changes due to COVID do you expect to be permanent? And what changes do you expect to be temporary? So I guess, great question. Like, I imagine masks, we're not going to wear masks forever, hopefully not. But what are some of the changes you expect to be more permanent and more temporary?
Yeah, well, some of the more permanent changes is I do think cleaning protocols at the company will be different. I think that's something that employees care about more than they have in the past. I agree. We hopefully won't see daily screening questionnaires or masks or even, social distancing at 6 feet. But I think we will see increased cleaning protocols and company attention to, if you have certain medical situations, you should not come to the office. I also think remote working is going to change dramatically. I think companies that prohibited remote working were forced to accept it and maybe realize that employees could still perform their job function. So I think that's one that will stay. We might see some employees transition back to the workforce, but I think remote work will play a bigger part of that. So that will affect, that flows to a lot of different policies like the technology systems policy, social media policies. If employees are really at home, what does the company expect? How are they using company time versus personal time? I think we're going to see a lot of policies that are affected by the permanence of remote working.
Yeah, there was a Pew Research study that basically found that before the pandemic, 20% of workers worked remotely mainly, and during the pandemic that jumped up to 71%, and that over 50% of all workers want to work remotely after the pandemic. So that's a big shift. 20 to 70, and then it's maybe land somewhere around 50% of all workers working remotely. That's big change. Obviously, a lot of policy implications there. Here's another question. Employment law has been changing so rapidly. Do you expect the law to change at the same pace moving forward? After, I guess, maybe the question is like after vaccines, after that's all been rolled out, will the law, do we expect the law to continue to change it or I guess what kind of pace do we expect the law to change after that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I do think that and this requires some conjecture on my part, but I think that we will see maybe a slowdown in the rapid pace of employment law changes. I think this past year was really just off the charts. And I think it will slow down a little bit, But I think there are other, we're seeing the pandemic, but we're also seeing a new administration that might have an increased focus on employment law. So there are other factors that might pick up, even though the pandemic might be hopefully coming to an end. I think we're going to see still significant employment law changes, maybe not as rapidly, but still something to pay close attention to.
So, so here's a good question that actually we've received a lot before. What are the risks of having some employees allowed to work remotely, but others not allowed to work remotely? I imagine that there are kind of, that there are some employees just have to work in person.
Yeah.
And, because of the nature of their job, but some employees can work remotely. And, that can be tricky, I think, with people. And so anyway, talk us through some of the kind of risks and things to look out for with that.
Yeah, I think there are a couple. So there are maybe potential legal risks that you might see if employees who are, and it depends, if their job functions really are different and require you to be in person to perform the job function, that might be different. But I think there's always a concern of discrimination and treating employees unequally. If some employees are given privileges that others are not, especially if the employees have a request for an accommodation that they could work remotely, but they're not given that opportunity. And then I also think you're going to just see employee morale issues. If you're treating some employees differently than other employees, I think that can affect how the employees view the company, whether they feel like they're not as high priority as other employees, and that can affect their productivity at work and just general employee morale. So I think there's legal, but there's also kind of other considerations that you might have in those when you're facing that issue.
Great. Thank you, Adrienne. So here's a question about this is in our chat about the pricing for the automated employee handbook product. So it says, I understand that customizing a policy for each company will have varying requirements and costs. What is a typical cost range for a company with 50 employees? Okay, so great question. The pricing for our automated employee handbook tool starts at $1,200 per year, so about $99 a month. For an employer with 50 employees, I think that the price is around $3,000 a year. Gosh, but we can connect you with an account representative to kind of suss that out. But I think that it's around $3,000 per year. So here's and actually anybody who's interested in the automated employee handbook product, you can go to the website sixfifty.com/SLC-handbook. So we set up a landing page for Salt Lake Chamber members. So sixfifty.com/SLC Salt Lake Chamber SLC-handbook. And somebody just put it in the chat, so you can find that URL in the chat there. Here's another question for you, Adrienne. What can you do if an employee doesn't want to come back to the office because of personal changes in their lifestyle? So I can totally understand this question. I think a lot of people maybe went back home, like working that way, maybe have started to arrange their life that way with childcare or whatnot. And what do you do if people don't want to come back?
Yeah, that's a tricky question. And some of it gets really into specific circumstances of what the employee might be, when you say lifestyle, what that specifically means. And that might require kind of a consultation with an employment lawyer to fully assess that. But in general, the company can set the expectations for what they require of employees. However, if employees have a disability and they request a reasonable accommodation and a disability as defined by the ADA, and request a reasonable accommodation, the company is required to provide that reasonable accommodation. And there's no set policy that working from home is a reasonable accommodation. But I think due to just the widespread nature of employees working from home right now, and by and large, the companies seem to be working fine and being very successful. I think it would be hard for a company to say that working from home is not is not a reasonable accommodation, that they can't allow the employee to do that because they can't perform their job when the employee has been doing it for a year and a half or 2 years by the time they transition back to work. So I think that requires kind of a unique analysis of the employee's situation. But if there's really no disability or unique circumstances, the company could just provide that this is company policy. We require employees to be at the workplace. And if the employee is not willing to abide by it, that could result in kind of whatever consequences the company has, but potentially leading up to termination.
Yeah, I think that the reasonable accommodation aspect to this, I think, makes it really complicated. Again, like you said, a lot of us have now worked from home for a year. Our company, for example, we went remote basically when Rudy Gobert got COVID on March 11th, and we've been remote ever since. And so again, it's really hard to say like, no, that job can't function remote. That complicates it. I think especially with the ADA, with the American Disabilities Act, boy, it's complicated. I mean, this whole situation really has thrown a wrench in a lot of different areas of employment law. Okay. Another question: what do you do if an employee doesn't want to wear a mask at the workplace? So for example, Utah, their mask mandate, I think, is ending in 2 days. But employers have discretion to require masks at the workplace. And actually, gosh, this is so tricky because some workers I know don't feel safe, without people wearing masks in the workplace. What can an employer do if an employee doesn't want to wear masks?
Yeah, that's another great question. And it does kind of depend on the employee's specific circumstance. So if the employee maybe has a medical condition that's preventing them from wearing a mask, that's going to be treated separately than an employee who just doesn't want to wear a mask because they think it's uncomfortable or they don't want to do it. So, but similar to kind of other company policies, assuming that the employee doesn't have a disability or a medical condition or something that prohibits them legally from complying with that requirement, the company could have policies that provide consequences for not following company guidelines. So whatever the company decides the consequences can be, they can set that expectation or standard for their workplace. And if employees are failing to meet that, the employee could be subject to the consequences, whatever they decide in the policy, whether that's not being allowed to work in the workplace or could potentially lead to termination if they're not meeting company expectations. But the company would want to document that they have a policy, that they ask the employee because they want to show that they have a procedure, ask the employee, they documented it, and then the employee maybe still didn't comply. So it gets complicated, but it could potentially result in an employee being terminated if they're not following company policy and they've been given ample opportunity to do so.
Perfect. And actually, one of the participants pointed out that the mask mandate has been extended. I think in Salt Lake City. So Salt Lake City, I think that the mayor came out and said, we're going to extend the mask mandate in basically in contradiction to the state, which is ending on April 10th. I think that I'm right on that. So for Salt Lake City businesses, obviously this is the Salt Lake Chamber of Commerce. The citywide mask mandate is continuing on. So again, I think that actually is a perfect example of why employment law is so difficult right now, because there are federal rules. There's the rules, from the CDC and the ADA and the Eeoc, all the federal acronymed agencies, and then there's states issuing their own mandates and rules, and then cities, and that those don't jive. The state is saying the mask mandate ends on April 10th. Salt Lake is saying, no, it's going to keep going. So this is a really tricky time. This layering of laws that are changing and in flux has just created just a really, really difficult situation. Okay, one other question that's come up here, Adrienne. Do you have any advice for someone who does a job development and placement for people with disabilities surrounding the transition from working in office to working remotely? So helping, people with disabilities, from working in office to working remotely, what are the things that they kind of have to look out for in this environment? Tricky
Yeah,
question.
and yeah, I know that could be I feel like that could be a long seminar on how to transition employees from the workplace to working from home. But I think we've seen kind of through trial and error in the past year about maybe how to do that more smoothly than some companies have had more of a rough transition. So I think having clear policies in place is a great starting point to that. You want to make sure employees understand what resources are available to them, what their expectations are for what are their working hours, when are they expected to be available to work, and what does being available mean, kind of what are their timekeeping protocols, and then what resources are available. Does the company provide equipment or other resources, or does the company have kind of a reimbursement policy for employees to obtain the equipment and then seek reimbursement, and what are the limits or parameters on that? I think then also not just having the policies in place, but then also kind of having frequent check-ins with the employee. I'm sure there will be it's unique. The transition from working in the office to working from home is unique. So each employee is going to have different challenges or questions. So I think having an open line of communication is very important to frequently check in with the employee, especially initially, to make sure that things are going smoothly, make sure they have everything they need to do their job or answer any questions that they have. So I think it kind of involves a lot of different components, but policies and then an open line of communication are a great first step to help employees transition.
Nice. Okay, here's a question we just had. Does SixFifty have monthly or yearly meetings with HR and admin companies if they enroll in the handbook service? And how is the personalized handbook updated per company? So great question. So because our handbook is automated and that it's it's online, it's like a TurboTax like format. You answer questions. It's basically the same questions that a lawyer would ask you, and based on your answers, the system in the background is doing exactly what a lawyer would do. It's if you answer yes to this question, it's adding in a paragraph. Then it'll follow up with some questions about how to customize that paragraph for you. We update the handbook every single month. So if there are changes, and so we're monitoring the law in all 50 states. We issue monthly updates that then we push to you via email or in-app. And so the policies will always be up to date. We're going to account for all the different changes that are happening, statewide and nationwide. And then we push those updates to you in an update, which actually I can show during the demo what that update looks like. In fact, I think that we just barely pushed an update for our employee handbook. Yeah, just the other day, so I can pull that up. And so anyway, it's updated on a regular basis. Which we thought was really important. Again, a lot of practitioners have recommended traditionally that you update your employee handbook once a year, and that's just not the case anymore. I think the law is changing so frequently and in such meaningful ways that really we kind of felt like more updates needed. So currently we're doing it once a month, pushing out updates once a month. If there are huge updates that need to be effected immediately, which happens all the time. Actually, it's happened before in California. Then we'll push an interim update between the monthly ones. So thank you for that, Jennifer. Good question. There are a lot of questions about vaccines, Adrienne, and we're lucky. Adrienne actually helped build out a vaccine policy that's included in this employee handbook to help companies manage their company's vaccinations. Could you just give? I know that could be its own webinar.
Yeah.
We gave an entire webinar about that. But could you kind of summarize maybe in 2 minutes, basically what the landscape looks like for employers about can they require vaccines? What the different options are there.
Yeah, that's great. There are a lot of vaccine questions, and I know that's a really hot topic right now. So the EEOC has specifically said that companies can require their employees to be vaccinated. There are exceptions to that. So if your employee has a disability or a religious exemption, then they would be exempt from that mandatory requirement. Otherwise, you can require employees to be vaccinated to enter the workforce. Companies can also have an optional vaccine policy or provide incentives for employees to be vaccinated. And that is probably the more common option that we're seeing right now, is a lot of companies are providing either a certain number of hours of paid time off, or a monetary benefit, or some other incentive for employees to be vaccinated as a way to encourage them, but to not mandate it, even though the EEOC has specifically said that the company can mandate vaccines with those exceptions. And when companies are implementing these vaccine policies, we see a lot of them that either have a mandatory policy or an optional policy, but under either policy, the company can ask employees for proof of vaccination. And companies want to be careful when they're asking employees for information about medical conditions. And that's why if an employee has a disability and is exempt from getting the vaccine, companies should be very careful in how they ask about that, and should ask for as limited medical information from employees as possible. But asking for proof of vaccine, especially if you're either mandating it or providing an incentive, is perfectly acceptable, that you can ask for that proof of vaccination. Let's see, I think those were kind of the high level vaccine questions that we've seen, but a lot of companies can do nothing, but we've seen more companies kind of take the encouragement approach, where they recommend employees get vaccinated and provide an incentive, and then ask for verification, but are careful to not ask too much information about medical conditions or exemptions.
Perfect. Okay, so that's one of the follow-up questions. Can an employer ask for proof of vaccination from their employees? And I think that the answer is yes, they can. You know, there are a lot of circumstances where, you know, they may not want to, but I think legally they can ask for that. They can ask for that verification. Is that right, Adrienne?
That's correct.
Okay, last, we have another question from Jennifer. Does 650's monthly, sorry, let me go back here and find this.
I think we answered this one about how we update the handbook, but do we have monthly?
Oh yeah. It was saying, once the handbook is updated, does the company need to distribute those updates to their employees each time? And I think that the answer is, for a lot of the updates, it doesn't require any kind of new distribution out to employees, but there are and have been during this pandemic several updates that may require employees to sign and certify that they've read and understand the policies. Is that kind of your understanding, Adrienne?
Yeah, that's right. And a lot of companies are opting to kind of select which policies they push out to, which notices they push out to employees. So companies will receive all the notice of the updates, and some of them may require updates to the handbook or policies, and others may not. But companies kind of have to decide, is this significant? Is this important enough that we should seek acknowledgement? Or is this a whole new policy that we want to make sure employees really understand that we're implementing? And so it really depends on kind of the significance and the frequency, and how difficult it is to obtain the acknowledgements that companies should seek acknowledgement or at least notify employees of changes to the employment policies or handbook.
Yeah, you know, it's this time is so tricky. You know, it's not surprising that people are asking about vaccines. You know, in our own experience with 650, you know, we have some people who don't want to be vaccinated. We have other people who don't want to go into the office with people who aren't vaccinated. And so, you know, it's a tricky balancing act. You know, I mean, and it puts businesses in the unfortunate situation of really, you know, not being able to please everybody here. And so, you know, a lot of the considerations for this are not necessarily legal. You know, they're more political and tactical. I mean, it's a very, very tricky situation. You know, one that we're dealing with too, as a company. And so anyway, some really great questions. I'm just going to pause for a second to see if anybody else has any other questions. You can put it into the Q&A. Your last chance to ask the knowledgeable, the wonderful Adrienne Jack to answer your employment questions related to COVID. Okay, so we're going to keep the Q&A open. And so if any more come in, you know, we can we can look at those, as this presentation has shown, and these questions, employment law really has never been more complex, and it's really affected the way we work and the way that we're interacting with everybody. And I'm sure everybody on this webinar would love to have kind of Adrienne by your side helping you. So I'm going to show you our employee handbook product briefly. And what we've tried to do is basically mimic the experience of working with an attorney like Adrienne inside of our computer system. And so, we've spent months plugging Wilson Sonsini's expertise and Adrienne's expertise into this product. And the product has 4 parts. And I'm going to show you each part one by one. So the first, you may think, I don't even know what policies I need. What policies are required in the different places where I'm located, and we have you covered there. We've created an assessment that will tell you what policies are required based on what states you're in and how many employees you have. And so I'll show you that briefly. Second, our system can help you generate an entire employee handbook from scratch. And basically it'll ask you the same questions a lawyer would ask you, and it customizes your document basically in the same way that a lawyer would do it. And so, again, we've really wanted to mimic kind of what it's like working with an attorney. You can also generate all of those employee handbook policies a la carte. So the employee handbook, you could shove all 50 into one document, or you can generate them a la carte. I'm going to share my screen here just to show you briefly how this works within our system. So this is our dashboard. And this dashboard will show you basically what products you have available depending on what you've purchased. So here on the left, you can see we have employee handbook, the policy library, and a little vaccine module that all comes with the product. So let's start with the state by state assessment. So here, and this is basically how our system works. You go to state assessment, you click new document, and then you'll see a list of questions. And so the state assessment's actually pretty easy. We just have you select what states you're in. So let's select Utah, and let's say maybe you have a location in Texas, and let's do a really easy regulatory state like California. Then you select save and continue. Then you name your document, Salt Lake Chamber Test. And that's it. So you answer the questions. Here, this will give you a list of the documents you've created. So you can tell that we've used this account for a lot of demos. And you can see that the system is generating the document behind the scenes. So based on your answers, the system is now piecing together this document, and putting together the different states and what's required in those states. So let's refresh. It's now ready. You click download the document. And here is the state assessment that we just generated. So here we go. Here are the required federal and state policies for California, if you have employees in California. So again, here are the federal policies. Here are the California specific policies. This is one of our favorites because it's the longest list of required policies in the nation. Then you can see Texas, a lot less state policies required. You still have the same federal policies, and Utah kind of somewhere in between, a little bit more than Texas, not nearly as much as California. And so you can basically plug in wherever you have employees, and it'll tell you what policies you need in each one of those jurisdictions. So that's the state by state assessment. Then you can go on and you can create an employee handbook from scratch. And so here you go to handbook, you click new document, and this is going to be a lot more complicated than the last one. This will basically ask you the same questions again that a lawyer would ask you. And we do it in basically 4 parts. We'll ask you about, again, where your employees are, how many you have. We'll kind of ask you about what policies you want. Again, there's a whole list of policies that are discretionary, that you don't have to have, maybe are a good idea to have in certain circumstances. And we'll kind of walk you through each one of those policies to see if you want them. And then we'll dive in and we'll ask you questions about, what your specific preferences are to customize those documents to you. And so the documents are in a queue. Depending on your answers here, we will take questions out, we'll add them in. And so, depending on your answers, you could have as many as 100 questions in this list. You can answer them in any order you want. And then once you're done, again, same process, you name the document and you download it. And I've downloaded a sample employee handbook here. The employee handbook can take an hour to answer all the questions, to customize it. The customization is so thorough that there are over 30 billion different variations of the product. So that's a lot of Adrienne brain power in there, figuring out how to customize it to your business. Here's again a sample employee handbook. We divide the handbook into 4 parts: policies about your commitment to your employees, a section about your expectations for your employees, a section about your relationship with your employees, and a section about time off. So there are a lot of leave laws that need to be taken into account, and that falls all under the time off section. We then have a linked table of contents, and then it jumps into the specific policies. We've marked these policies by icons, so you can tell which policies are in the Our Commitment section by the icon. We stick an icon next to each one of those policies so that you can visually see where you're located. We give you this document in Word so that you can edit it however you want afterward. If it's not customized quite enough just from our questions, you could take it and run with it. So this employee handbook, I think, is 100 pages long. So this is a lot of work and logic that goes into creating this. The employee handbook will also include all of the certifications you need for your employees. So for example, in Washington, you need your employees to sign and acknowledge the discrimination, the anti-discrimination, harassment, and retaliation policy. And so we give you the right language drafted by Wilson Sonsini attorneys that you need your employees to sign. Again, so, the alcohol and drug abuse policy, and so on and so forth. All of the things that you need your employees to sign and to have at their disposal, we also include in the employee handbook. Finally, if you want to create policies a la carte, so if you don't want to create the whole handbook all at once, but you may already have a handbook and you think, well, okay, I just need a crime and victim leave policy, or I just need a gifts policy, or I just want to update this part or that part. We offer all the 50 employment policies a la carte. So you can go in, answer a few questions, download a customized policy to you, and you can do it within minutes. Finally, there are updates. So let me show you how these come in. Here's our update docket. And so these are updates basically for all the products we do, but for employee handbook, here's an update that we issued just a few days ago. We will email this update to you. We will also show you in the app where that update is. And so this gives you everything that has changed in the month of March for the employee handbook. Like we added a social media policy. We adjusted the sick leave policy. There were some changes in Wyoming and Nebraska. And we've updated a few other policies. And we'll let you know basically whether the changes are more cosmetic, whether they're, how important they are, and whether you need to have your employees re-acknowledge them based on the changes. But you'll get basically an update about all of the changes happening to employment law in the nation every month. And then if you need to regenerate your documents, sometimes we'll say, hey, you need to answer a few more questions. You can go into the system and regenerate it. We save all your prior answers, and it just takes a few minutes. So that's kind of a quick demo. We have just a few more minutes. So we can answer some questions. Okay, so here's a question about the handbook. Do you provide your your policy handbook in additional languages for English second language workers? That is such a good question. Thank you so much for that. It's only available currently in English. We actually do build products in Spanish. So our free pro bono product for people who are at risk of eviction, hellolandlord.org, you can access in both English and Spanish. This we have not. It's a great question. It's something that we're looking into. We care a lot about, especially the Latin community here. And so something we're looking into, but unfortunately that we don't have now. Our employee handbook is only available in English right now. Okay, so so we have another question from Dave Arnold. So it says, the state of Utah is willing to reimburse our payments to employees for the first time they're quarantined at home with COVID. Okay, so 1 second. Let me make sure that I'm understanding this. Oh, okay. So I think that the question is, how does the employee handbook deal with conflicting laws? So what if a state law says this, but the city law says that, and maybe a federal law says something else? How does it deal with that? Or what if two states require different things and you're in both states? So under the state scenario, employers actually have a lot of flexibility within our system. They could generate just an employee handbook, all customized for Wyoming, let's say, and then generate a separate employee handbook on our system that's just for Utah. So that way, employees don't see kind of the conflicts that maybe some states get more benefits than others based on what's required by a state law. And so you can generate it basically all together, all the states in one. And there we basically delineate the different, for Washington residents, here's the policy, and for California residents, here's the policy around jury leave and whatnot. Or you can generate them separate. For when federal law and state law and city law conflict, that's a really good question. I think just under the precedent of law, federal law holds a supersedes state law, and state law supersedes city law. Although we're seeing that conflict, for example, now in Salt Lake City. The state mandate is ending. Salt Lake City has said that they're extending it. I think businesses basically have to obey that city guideline until there's some kind of legal challenge. At least that's what we would recommend. And so again, this is such a tricky time, a tricky time for those issues. Okay. Any other questions? Last questions, last chance. We have 3 more minutes. Last question. Any questions about the handbook? Any questions for Adrienne? You can put it in the chat. You can put it in the Q&A. Actually, I guess we prefer that it goes into the Q&A so that we can log them. But any last questions? Okay, I think we're all tuckered out. Natalie?
Thank you. This was very informative. I've asked several of my own questions, although I think I put them in the chat, so I apologize. But very informative, and obviously, as we saw from all of the information, as well as the questions that were going back and forth, that it's a complex issue and that it's something that employers are facing right now and trying to navigate. So thank you for your time. Thank you for all of the information. As they said, that there was a link in the chat, and just one more time, that's SixFifty.com/SLC-handbook. Is that correct?
That's right. That's right. Yeah, that's right. SixFifty.com/SLC-handbook. And I'll just put it in the chat right now so that people can, because now it's like, way up there. It's probably going to be hard to find.
Yeah. Thank you.
And yeah, we'd love to help whoever needs it. No pressure, obviously, but our mission is really to kind of bring Wilson Sonsini's expertise to as many companies as possible. So we'd love to help whoever needs it.
Well, thank you. And I'll personally be reaching out myself. So we appreciate everybody's participation and attendance today. Thank you on behalf of the Salt Lake Chamber. This event has been sponsored by the Small Business Committee. And if you're interested in learning more about the Small Business Committee, please feel free to reach out to saltlakechamber.com. I hope everybody stays well and healthy, and we look forward to seeing you soon. Take care.
Thank you very much.